On the night I turned 70, the candles on my cake never flickered. The dining table sat dressed for a party that never began. My son had promised he'd come. Instead, he sent a single text. "Sorry, Mom. We're with Anna's family tonight." That was the moment I realized my presence had become optional in his life. My name is Margaret Evans, and I am 70 years old. I never thought I'd be telling my story this way to strangers with my voice trembling and my heart still roar. But sometimes the truth has to be spoken aloud, because silence is what broke me for too many years. Silence when I cried after my husband passed. Silence when my son grew distant after marrying. And silence on the very night that should have been filled with laughter, not emptiness. Let me take you back. I was born in 1955 in a small town where family meant everything. I carried those values into adulthood through decades of marriage and motherhood. When my husband died of a sudden heart attack 15 years ago, I thought my world had ended. But my son David was only 20 at the time. I told myself, I can't break. Not now. He still needs me. And so I didn't break. I worked long shifts, picked up odd jobs, sold my jewelry one piece at a time, just so David could finish college without drowning in loans. I stitched every hole in his shirts, made sure his fridge was never empty, and cheered for him at every milestone. I thought the bond between us was unshakable. But then came Anna, his wife. She was polite at first, with her practiced smile and soft compliments. I wanted to welcome her. Truly, I did. I told myself, he's found love, he's found his partner. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to rewrite the script of our family. Dinners where I was once the host became dinners I wasn't invited to. Holidays I had always prepared were suddenly spent in her parents' home. My traditions, my presents, began to fade into the background as though I were a character no longer needed in the play. I tried to ignore it. I convinced myself they were just busy, that I was imagining the distance. But reality has a way of forcing itself into your chest until you can't breathe. And for me, that reality came on my 71st birthday. I had been preparing for weeks. I baked a cake, his favorite, chocolate with buttercream frosting. I laid out the table with the same plates we'd used every birthday since he was a boy. The house smelled of roasted chicken, the kind he always loved when he came home from college. I even set out candles, silly ones shaped like stars that I'd been saving for a special occasion. The clock ticked. 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8. I told myself, traffic must be terrible. At 9, I called his phone and it went to voicemail. At 9, my screen lit up with the text. "Sorry, Mom. We're at Anna's parents' house tonight. They planned a dinner. I'll see you another time." That was all. No apology, no promise to come later, just dismissal wrapped in casual words. I sat at the table alone. The candles stayed unlit, the chicken went cold. I sliced one piece of cake, but I couldn't eat it. My hands shook so badly the frosting smeared across the plate. I remember looking at the clock, each second dragging louder and louder until it felt like the walls themselves were mocking me within their emptiness. Do you know what it feels like to be forgotten on your birthday? To realize that the child you carried, the child you sacrificed for, the child you thought would always be your anchor, has chosen someone else's table, someone else's laughter over you. It's not just loneliness, it's erasure. It's the kind of pain that makes you question every choice you ever made. Every time you stayed up late sewing costumes. Every time you worked 2 jobs just to pay his tuition. Every time you swallowed your own grief so he wouldn't feel fatherless. That night, I walked through my house room by room. The walls were lined with photographs. David as a boy holding his first bicycle. David at graduation. David with me on Christmas morning. I stared at those frozen smiles and realized something terrifying. The love I had poured into him had become a one-way river. He drank from it freely, but he never poured anything back. And then a thought crept in. One I had never allowed myself before. If my son could leave me behind so easily, then perhaps I could leave him behind too. That birthday wasn't just a disappointment. It was a revelation. A curtain pulled back on the illusion I had been clinging to. For the first time in 70 years, I stopped thinking of myself as a mother who had to endure anything and started seeing myself as a woman who still had choices. And that, my friends, was the beginning of everything. The morning after my birthday, I woke to silence. Not the peaceful kind like birds greeting the dawn, but the heavy silence that presses on your chest. The kind that reminds you the phone didn't ring. No one knocked at the door. And the cake from last night still sat untouched on the counter, its frosting beginning to harden. I stood there staring at it, and memories hit me like blows. I thought of all the birthdays I'd given my son. The one where he was 5 when I stayed up all night sewing a red cape for his superhero costume. The one at 12 when I pawned my gold bracelet so I could afford the bicycle he wanted. The one at 18 when I filled the house with balloons even though I could barely pay the rent. I gave him laughter, surprise, warmth, and what did I get on my 70th? A text, a brush-off, a reminder that I didn't matter enough to even sit at the same table. I tried to shake it off at first, told myself maybe they'd visit the next day. Maybe Anna's family had pressured him. Maybe he hadn't wanted to disappoint them. But deep down, I knew better. It wasn't the first time. It was just the worst. There had been hints for years, the missed calls on Christmas morning, the way Anna rolled her eyes whenever I told a story about his childhood, the vacations they took without inviting me while I stayed behind to water their plants and feed their dog. Each time I told myself not to be dramatic. Each time I swallowed the sting and carried on. But something inside me shifted that night, and by the morning, the shift had hardened into resolve. I realized I had been clinging to an illusion of family while he had been clinging to my resources, my house, my time, my sacrifices. I walked into the living room and sat in the armchair where I'd once read him bedtime stories. My eyes landed on a framed photograph, his wedding day. I remembered sitting in the church pew, smiling as tears burned behind my eyes. That day, I had told myself I was gaining a daughter. What I hadn't known was that I'd be losing my son. The phone sat beside me on the table. I picked it up and scrolled through old messages. Weeks of unanswered, "How are you" texts, occasional quick responses, curtain rushed, "Busy mom, talk later." That later rarely came. I realized I had become background noise in his life, something to be muted until convenient. My chest tightened, but then another thought cut through the pain. If he could celebrate without me on my birthday, then I could build a life without him in mine. I stood up, stronger now than I had felt in years. For so long I had been waiting for phone calls, waiting for visits, waiting for proof that I still mattered. What if I stopped waiting? What if I took that time, that energy, and gave it back to myself? I walked into the study and pulled out a box from the top shelf. Inside were important papers, bank statements, property deeds, my will. For years, every line of that will had David's name written on it. My house, my savings, even the modest jewelry collection my mother left me. All of it was his. I had always believed that was what a mother was supposed to do, leave behind everything for her child. But what had he left for me? Nothing. Not time, not gratitude, not love. The betrayal burned in my chest, but it also fueled me. In that moment, I made a silent vow. He would never again mistake my love for weakness. I closed the box, clutching it against my chest like a shield. My plan wasn't fully formed yet, but the seed was planted. The will would change. The future would change. And this house, these walls that had seen so many tears and so many lonely nights, would not define me anymore. That afternoon I went outside for a walk. The sun was bright, the air crisp, and yet I felt the heaviness of decades pressing on my shoulders. As I passed by, neighbors waved. Some even asked how my birthday had gone. I smiled politely, swallowing the truth. How could I tell them that I had celebrated alone, that the sun I once thought was my anchor had left me to drift? I reached the park at the end of the street and sat on a bench beneath an oak tree. Children were playing, their laughter ringing through the air. Parents chased them, calling their names, holding them close. I watched with a hollow ache in my chest. That was once me. That was once David and me, and now he had chosen another family's laughter over mine. The realization was brutal, but it was also clarifying. That birthday wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I stopped being the forgotten mother and started being the woman who finally chose herself. I whispered it aloud just to hear the sound of it. No more waiting, no more begging, no more giving to those who don't care. The words felt foreign at first, but as they settled in the air, they began to feel like truth, and with that truth came a strange calm. I stood up from the bench, steadier now, and walked home. My heart still ached. Yes, but it beat with something I hadn't felt in years. Resolve. The morning after my walk, I didn't wake up feeling lighter. In fact, my body felt heavy, as though I'd carried grief through the night. But underneath it all, there was a pulse of determination, steady and insistent. The kind of determination that doesn't fade once the sun rises. I brewed a pot of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and spread out my papers, bank statements, the deed to my house, my insurance policy, and finally, my will. The will had David's name on every line. He was my only child. Who else would I leave it all to? For decades that had seemed natural, unquestionable. But as I stared at the ink on those pages, I felt anger rise, not hot and wild, but cold and steady. Why should he inherit the fruits of my sacrifice when he couldn't even pick up the phone on my birthday? Why should he reap the rewards of a life he had dismissed, belittled, and abandoned? I made the call to my lawyer that same morning. His name was Mr. Hartley, a man in his 60s with thinning gray hair and a no-nonsense tone. I'd known him for years. He had helped me handle my husband's estate. When he picked up, I didn't hesitate. Mr. Hartley, I need to change my will immediately. He paused. Change it? Mrs. Evans, is everything all right? I almost laughed at the question. All right? I was 70 years old, celebrating milestones alone, dismissed by the only person I had left. But instead of spilling my heartbreak, I kept my tone calm. Yes, I said. I want it all removed from David's name. Every cent, every asset. None of it goes to him. There was silence on the line. Finally, he cleared his throat. And where would you like it to go? Charities? Scholarships? Causes that give children chances. The kind of chances I worked myself raw to give my son. But not him. Never again him. When I arrived at his office later that week, I carried the weight of my decision like a shield. Mr. Hartley reviewed the documents with his careful eyes, making adjustments, typing out clauses that cut David out with surgical precision. Each stroke of the pen felt like another chain breaking free from my wrists. Are you certain about this? He asked when it was done. I looked him squarely in the eyes. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Walking out of that office, the world looked sharper, clearer. I wasn't powerless anymore. I had taken the first step, but I wasn't done. That evening, I began going through my house, not with the eyes of a homeowner, but with the eyes of a woman preparing to let go. The living room, with its old floral couch and sagging armchair, the china cabinet, filled with dishes my daughter-in-law had once claimed as hers in casual conversation. The dining table where I had waited on my birthday. I touched each item and asked myself, does this serve me or does this serve him? David's childhood trophies are gathering dust out his old books. He never came to reclaim, donated the desk he once said he'd take when I was done with it. I laughed bitterly at the memory, then listed it for sale online. For years I had clung to these objects as symbols of family. Now I saw them for what they were. Anchors tying me to a son who had already set sail without me. Day by day I stripped the house bare. Strangers came and went, handing me cash in exchange for furniture, appliances, paintings. Each time an item left the house, I felt lighter. One afternoon, a young couple came to buy the dining table. As they carried it out, I caught sight of the empty space left behind. At first it startled me, but then I smiled. That table had once been a stage for disappointment. Now it was gone, and so was the weight of waiting at it year after year. The money from these sales didn't go into the account David knew about. No, I opened a new one, a private account only in my name. For the first time in decades, I had money set aside that no one could touch, not even him. At night, I sat at the kitchen counter with a notebook. I began to write, not letters to my son, but letters to myself, promises, reminders, words I wished I'd heard from someone else, but now needed to speak into existence. You are worth more than neglect. You are allowed to leave. You do not need his permission to live. Those letters became my secret strength. Whenever doubt crept in, I would open that notebook and remind myself of who I was becoming. Not a forgotten mother, but a woman reclaiming her life. And though David had no idea what was happening, every step I took carried me further away from his grasp. Changing my will was just the beginning, selling the house, leaving everything behind that would come next. But as I folded another empty box and stacked it by the door, I whispered to myself, he left me alone on my birthday. Now I'm leaving him alone for the rest of his life. By the time the house grew sparse, and echoes replaced the sound of footsteps, my plan had already stretched far beyond the walls I was stripping bare. Cutting David out of my will had given me a taste of freedom. But freedom requires more than ink and signatures. It requires action. It requires vanishing from the web of obligations that others think they can tug at whenever it suits them. So I began preparing in secret. The first thing I did was open a new bank account. I'd already been selling furniture and personal items, but now, with each transaction, I deposited the money directly into that account. No traces, no digital alerts. If David ever tried to snoop, or worse, pressure me into sharing, he'd find nothing but shadows. Then I made another call, this time not to a lawyer, but to a relocation agency that specialized in helping retirees settle abroad. A cheerful woman named Clara Ara picked up. Her voice brimmed with warmth as she explained the process. Visas, medical care, property rentals in quiet seaside towns. I didn't tell her much about why I was leaving. She didn't ask. All she said was, "We'll make sure you're comfortable and safe." Those words felt like balm on a wound I hadn't realized was still open. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, the weight of the decision settling over me. I was truly going. I wasn't just changing locks or rearranging furniture. I was cutting the final threads. But before I left, I wanted to make sure the story of what happened to me wouldn't be erased. So one evening, under the dim kitchen light, I gathered every bank statement, every receipt, every message that proved David's neglect. I made copies of everything. Then I bought a sturdy envelope and began assembling what I would later call the record. On the first page, I wrote in bold letters, "This is what you chose. This is why I chose differently." I slipped in credit card statements that showed dinners with Anna's family while I ate alone, copies of the will, both the old one and the new, photographs of my untouched birthday cake, candles still sealed in their package. Each piece of paper was a blade cutting away the illusion that his abandonment was accidental. When the envelope was sealed, I tucked it into the old family album, the one filled with birthdays and Christmas mornings and smiling faces. I knew when he returned, it would be one of the first things he looked for, proof that he still owned a piece of my past. Instead, he'd find proof that he had lost his place in my future. But even that wasn't enough. I wanted more than a house emptied of his expectations. I wanted to build a life in a place where his shadow couldn't reach me. And so I began packing, not with the frantic hands of someone running, but with the deliberate care of someone reclaiming her story. Into a single suitcase went the essentials. My journals, filled with decades of thoughts and secrets I never shared. A faded quilt my mother had made for me when I was a child. My late husband's pocket watch, the only piece of him I still carried. A few photographs, not of David or Anna, but of places and people who once made me feel alive. Everything else stayed behind. Every dish my daughter-in-law once laid claim to. Every piece of furniture David assumed would be his left. Let them walk into empty rooms and feel the sting of absence. Let them realize too late that nothing had ever truly belonged to them. I also wrote a letter, not for David to see right away, but for myself. I folded it into my notebook, a reminder for the nights I knew I would waver. It said, "You are not abandoning him. He abandoned you long before this. You are not cruel. You are choosing peace. Do not let guilt drag you back into chains." The hardest part wasn't the packing or the paperwork or even the secrecy. The hardest part was facing the mirror, looking into my own eyes and admitting, I am not leaving because I stopped loving him. I am leaving because I finally started loving myself. In the weeks that followed, I rehearsed my silence. Every time the phone rang with his number flashing across the screen, I let it buzz unanswered. Every time Anna posted photos online of their dinners and celebrations, I scrolled past them like a stranger. I was practicing detachment, building calluses over wounds that had bled too long. Finally, I booked the ticket, a one-way flight to a small coastal town abroad. I didn't even tell my neighbors where I was going. Only Clara Ara from this agency knew, and she assured me all arrangements were ready. The night before departure, I sat on the bare floor of my living room. The air smelled faintly of dust and emptiness. I traced my hand across the hardwood, remembering my son's first steps, my husband's laughter echoing during family dinners. Memories clawed at me, but I held firm. Memories don't make a family. Presence does. Respect does. Love does. I whispered into the empty house as though the walls needed to hear it one last time. He left me alone when it mattered most. Tomorrow I leave him behind for good. And as I zipped my suitcase shut, I realized this wasn't running away. This was walking toward the life I should have chosen years ago. The morning of my departure arrived with the sky painted in pale gray, the kind of dawn that feels suspended between endings and beginnings. I woke before the alarm, sat on the edge of my bed, and let the silence press against me one last time. There would be no goodbyes, no tears at the door, no arms wrapping me in comfort, only me, my suitcase, and the decision I had waited far too long to make. I walked through the house slowly, touching the walls as if I were tracing the outline of a body I had once loved, but no longer recognized. The rooms were hollow, emptied of furniture, but they still whispered with ghosts, the laughter of birthday parties long past. The sound of David's tiny footsteps racing across the floor. My husband's voice calling from the kitchen. Each memory rose up like smoke, clinging to me, begging me to stay. But I knew better now. Memories can't hold you when you're sick. Memories don't light candles for you when you're forgotten. Memories don't call on your birthday. I paused in the dining room, staring at the bare space where the table had once stood. That table had been the altar of my patience, the place I had waited year after year for family to show up, only to eat in silence. Now, it was gone. The emptiness of the room felt cleaner, freer. Before leaving, I slipped the envelope, the one filled with receipts, copies of the will and my letter, into the family album and placed it back on the shelf. I left it just crooked enough so I knew David would see it when he came searching. My goodbye to him wasn't in hugs or explanations. It was in truth, spelled out on paper. The taxi pulled up quietly, its headlights glowing against the morning mist. The driver, a kind-eyed man with salt and pepper hair, stepped out to load my suitcase. "Heading to the airport?" he asked. "Yes," I said simply, my voice steady. As we drove away, I didn't look back at the house right away. I told myself it was just a building now, nothing more. But at the end of the street as we turned, I allowed myself one glance. The curtains swayed gently in the breeze through the open window I had left cracked. To anyone else, it looked like an ordinary house, but to me it was a morsel of waiting, of sacrifice, of silence. I let the image burn into me, then exhaled and turned away. The cab ride felt longer than it was. We passed families loading children into minivans, couples walking dogs, teenagers on bicycles. They moved through their morning routines with a kind of unconscious joy. I wondered if David was awake yet, if he had even remembered my birthday had passed. Did he roll over in bed and feel any guilt at all? Or was I already an afterthought? The airport smelled of coffee and jet fuel, a mixture of urgency and anticipation. As I wheeled my single suitcase through the sliding doors, I felt oddly invisible among the crowds. No one knew that I was not just taking a trip, but leaving behind an entire life. No one knew that this flight wasn't a vacation. It was liberation. At the check-in counter, the clerk smiled politely as she took my passport. "One way to Lisbon," she said, stamping the ticket. The word "one way" echoed in my mind. Final, absolute, uncompromising. Security, boarding, the shuffle of passengers finding their seats. It all blurred together. My heart pounded. Not from fear, but from something sharper, release. When the plane lifted off the ground, I closed my eyes and whispered to myself, "You're free now." Hours later, when the plane touched down on foreign soil, the air felt different the moment I stepped off. Lighter, saltier, filled with possibility. A driver from the relocation agency waited for me with a sign that read, "Mrs. Evans." For once, it didn't sting to be identified without family. It felt right. The cottage was small, tucked near the sea. Whitewashed walls, blue shutters, and the faint smell of lavender drifting in from the garden. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I was greeted not by dust or silence heavy with disappointment, but by emptiness that felt like promise. A blank page waiting for me to write on. That night, I unpacked my few belongings, my journals, my quilt, my husband's pocket watch. I placed them gently around the room like anchors. Then I opened the windows and listened to the ocean. Waves rolled and broke, steady as a heartbeat. For the first time in years, I slept without waiting for a call, without hoping for a knock at the door. The next morning, I walked barefoot to the shoreline. The sun painted the water gold, and fishermen were already pulling in their nets. One waved, and I found myself waving back, a smile tugging at my lips. I felt small, but in the best way, like a piece of a wider, kinder world that had nothing to do with the coldness of my son's neglect. And as the waves lapped at my feet, I whispered a quiet truth. He left me behind once. Now I've left him behind forever. Back home, the house stood waiting. Though not in the way David imagined. He returned one sunny afternoon, suitcase wheels rattling against the driveway, his wife trailing behind him, her face buried in her phone. They looked rested, tanned, smug from a week of comfort with her family. He pulled out his key, slid it into the lock, and froze. It didn't turn. He jiggled it harder, muttering under his breath. "Lisa, did you change the locks?" His wife gave him a puzzled look. "Why would I?" It's your mother's house. He tried again, the metal scraping uselessly against the tumblers. Irritation darkened his face. He slammed the key harder, but the door refused him. That was when he pressed his forehead to the glass and saw it. Nothing. The house was stripped bare, the sofa gone, the shelves empty, the walls naked. "Lisa," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It's empty." She peered inside, her expression twisting from confusion to alarm. But where's all her stuff? Where's she? The neighbors had been waiting for this moment. Mrs. Kendall from across the street, apron dusted with flour, waved cheerfully from her porch. "Oh, you just missed your mother. Packed everything up a few weeks ago. Looked happier than I've seen her in years." David's stomach dropped. "Packed? Where?" he barked. The neighbor shrugged. "Didn't say, just that she was off to start fresh." Panic bloomed across his face. He pulled out his phone, dialing her number over and over. Ring after ring, no answer. He left voicemails, his tone shifting from sharp irritation to pleading. Still silence. Finally, Lisa noticed the photo album on the shelf, slightly crooked, as though waiting to be discovered. She pulled it down, flipped it open, and found the envelope. With trembling fingers, David tore it open. Inside were the copies. The old will naming him heir, the new one cutting him out, bank records, photographs of the untouched birthday cake, and then the letter. "While I lay forgotten on my 71st birthday, you chose another table. You celebrated without me, but you remembered to use my love, my money, my home. For years I excused your absence, told myself it was just life pulling you away. But this was no accident, it was a choice. And now I have made mine. The house is sold, the money is gone. My will no longer carries your name. I am not your safety net, your inheritance, or your afterthought. I am simply your mother, and you abandoned me. Consider this the last memory we share. Don't look for me. I will not be found." The words sliced deeper with every line, his face drained of color, his lips trembling. Lisa leaned over his shoulder, tears brimming in her eyes. She can't mean this," Lisa stammered, but David knew she did. He called again, then again. His mother's silence screamed louder than his shouts. For the first time, the son, who had always assumed she would be there waiting, was left with nothing but an empty house and a letter that severed the cord he thought would never break. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, I sat on the veranda of my cottage, the ocean wind lifting my hair, a cup of tea warming my hands. My phone buzzed on the table. His name flashed across the screen. I didn't answer. Instead, I let the waves fill the silence, a rhythm steadier than any heartache. Around me, life unfolded simply. Fishermen calling to one another, children laughing as they played in the sand, neighbors passing with kind smiles. That night, I walked to the shoreline, letting the sea foam lick at my feet. Above me, the stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. And for the first time in decades, I didn't feel forgotten. I felt chosen by myself. Back in that empty house, David sat with the letter in his hands, his wife whispering questions he couldn't answer. His children asked why Grandma wasn't there. He had no explanation, no comfort, nothing left to claim. And I, far away, smiled softly to myself. He had celebrated without me once. Now he would live without me forever.